and welcome to the second part of this mini-series on exporting the French Revolution throughout Central Europe. Today we are going to be discussing the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Prior to the French Revolution, what is now modern Germany, Austria, Czechia, Belgium, Luxembourg, also including parts of Western Poland, Pomerania and Silesia, made up the legal territory of the Holy Roman Empire, the entity founded by Otto the Great in the 10th century, while the naming convention goes back to the reign of Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century. Though this is the beginning of a continuous state around the year 962 all the way up until 1806, with a defined territory which changes intermittently, Burgundy here, parts of Italy here, then you see a raft of French conquest, which caused a huge amount of what was Holy Roman Imperial territory in Lorraine and the Free County of Burgundy to be ceded over France. This is the point where we see a continuous territory, a legal entity called the Holy Roman Empire. Nevertheless, it is often claimed, and this is some form of contention with historians, even though I don't really understand why, that the beginning of the Carolingian Empire, the Empire of Charlemagne, and indeed Charlemagne's coronation as the Emperor of the Romans in the year 800 was the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. And what this represents is the reconstitution of a successor of the Roman Empire founded on the authority of the Pope, and in this particular case, in the opposition to the Roman emperors in Constantinople, at a time where to be emperor meant to be not only the successor of Rome, but the universal standard bearer of Christendom, and by the Pope crowning Charlemagne and later the Holy Roman Emperors, Catholic Christendom in particular. With one interruption, the rulers of that empire in the late stage, the emperors themselves, came from a single family for 350 years, the Habsburgs of Austria. The second Habsburg emperor, Maximilian, had attempted to consolidate the empire via Reichsreform, the creation of common institutions that would endure until the empire's dissolution. The later Habsburg Ferdinand II, with the support of the military genius von Wallenstein, consolidated the crown lands of the emperor in Bohemia and Austria and led several expeditions to the north and west of Germany in an attempt to confirm the empire as sovereign and primarily Catholic in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. The failure and death of Ferdinand II during the 30 Years' War represented the last serious attempt to consolidate the empire into a single, continuous, and possibly even centralized entity. Instead, the empire was confirmed as multi-confessional and decentralized, the so-called German liberty, with Catholic, Calvinist, and Lutheran German princes having their rights confirmed at Westphalia in 1648, based on a precedent going back 300 years earlier. While the common institutions of the empire endured, the emperor never achieved the centralization of the state into something resembling a German-led nation-state. Indeed, the 30 Years' War had demonstrated that the empire's neighbors were prepared to intervene to prevent such a creation. Instead, the emperor focused on his own dynastic holdings, especially Hungary, after its reconquest in the Great Turkish War. Collectively, no single prince in the empire, among the empire's hundreds of princes, had been powerful enough to contest the emperor's authority. During the Austrian War of Succession, the Habsburgs temporarily lost the imperial throne to the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, while the ambitious new king in Prussia, Frederick II, seized Silesia from the Habsburg Mary Theresa. Though the Habsburgs regained the imperial throne, they never regained Silesia, one of the formerly most prosperous domains in the entire Habsburg realm, even while Prussia was surrounded by France, Austria, and Russia in the 7 Years' War. In 1772, the Prussians led the process of dismembering Poland, gaining control over the Vistula, Poland's principal artery for trade. In 1778, Emperor Joseph II attempted to sell the Habsburg possessions in Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands, in exchange for Bavaria during the Bavarian succession crisis, consolidating the imperial crownlands into a single continuous domain across the Danube, with a significant core in Germany to act as a counterbalance to the Habsburg possession of Hungary. Fearing that this conquest would upset the balance of power in the empire, King Frederick II of Prussia successfully cast himself as the defender of German liberty and the smaller states, frustrating the plans of the emperor. In so doing, Prussia confirmed that the empire had a dual authority, a single nation with two great powers. Frederick II died in 1786, leaving Napoleon Bonaparte a model for his later inspiration. Frederick II, though far from victorious in every battle, was both a strategic genius who directly led Prussian armies into battle, aggressively and tenaciously, to transform Prussia from a German statelet into a major European power. Moreover, Frederick's power extended from the formidable reputation and glory of the Prussian army. In battle, Frederick presented himself in a simple, unadorned soldier's uniform, the Alte Fritz, the Old Fritz, attire that Napoleon would directly imitate as the Little Corporal in his quintessential bicorn hat. Otherwise, Frederick II was a capable statesman and politician, a follower of the Enlightenment, and a friend and patron of Voltaire. Frederick II could conceivably be regarded as the world's first enlightened absolutist or despot, implementing centralizing and secularizing reforms and patents of religious tolerance from above, though a comprehensive Prussian legal code would only be implemented after his death. It is obvious where Napoleon found his political inspiration, power emanating from the military and resting on the pursuit of martial glory, expanding his domain by force, all the while appealing to the example of an enlightened despot. It is entirely understandable that Napoleon lamented upon his conquest of Berlin in 1806 that had Frederick II been alive to oppose him, Napoleon wouldn't have been there. Nevertheless, one shouldn't overlook the revolutionary precursor in Frederick II's rival, Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor. Though Joseph II couldn't extend his authority beyond his dynastic domains, Joseph not only intended to build up the reforms of his mother in Austria and Bohemia, but aimed to establish a uniform German system of administration, underpinned by the principles of the Enlightenment, throughout the many non-German kingdoms and territories of which Joseph was sovereign. The central aspect of Josephinism was an emphasis on the secular authority of the emperor and the state at the expense of the church, compared to which France in its revolution was a relative latecomer. See Gallicanism and Febronianism as discussed in previous lectures. Joseph clamped down on the monasteries, religious orders, even the celebration of saints' days, and aimed to create a uniform Catholic iteration of Mass, the Vienna Mass, subordinating the Catholic Church to the state, whilst giving rights to non-Catholics, Austria's Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, nearly 2 decades before Napoleon would do the same. Unlike Frederick II, Joseph could not combine his radical and rapid reform agenda with military glory, whether it be in Bavaria or his disastrous adventure against the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, Joseph's reform program was far more ambitious than Frederick's. The resistance to Joseph was most profound in Belgium with its Brabantine Revolution. Joseph had been successful in alienating all the orders of the Austrian Netherlands all at once, with the peasants angry at the limitation of their feast days, clerics protesting the violation of papal prerogatives and, of course, the dissolution of their own monasteries, or nobles resisting the implementation of a managerial bureaucratic administration throughout the empire. At first, the rebels fled to the nearby Netherlands, only to be inspired by the French Revolution in July of 1789 to return to the Austrian Netherlands and defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Turnhout. A new Belgian state was created after the Manifesto of Brabant and the Treaty of Union. Joseph II died shortly afterwards, but the revolt was crushed by Joseph's brother and Emperor Leopold II. Though the revolution in Brabant is notable as an early indication of Belgian self-determination and as an echo of the French Revolution throughout Europe, the effect of Joseph's reforms had been to undermine loyalty to the Habsburgs in a vulnerable province which would soon become the principal object of French expansion. Habsburg authority would only last 4 years and thereafter never be restored. Having discussed potential Napoleonic precursors in the form of enlightened absolutists, it is important to consider the state of the Enlightenment elsewhere in Germany. Beyond the 2 major states of the empire, Prussia and Austria, Germany was home to thousands of individual autonomous territories, of which around 300 enjoyed the German liberty, or superioritas territorialis, de facto sovereignty, after the calamities of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, though the precedent is much older, going back to Frederick Barbarossa and the fall of the Hohenstaufens, the dissolution of the Duchy of Swabia into many free and imperial cities. Major states to remember throughout this lecture being Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, Mainz, and Hesse. Such states with this reorganized status were admitted to the imperial diet, where they debate topics such as common defense, while the states themselves were grouped into the Reichskreis, a system that had remained intact after 300 years. Such organizations were founded to coordinate opposition to foreign invasion. France had been the most persistent enemy of the empire, Sweden having risen and fallen during the time of Gustavus Adolphus and then collapsed during the reign of Charles XII, while the Ottomans, of course, had been one of the greatest threats to Christendom in the 15th and 16th centuries, but by the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was in full decline. The main precedent we have prior to the revolution of a foreign power exploiting the decentralized nature of the empire to serve as expansion comes in the form of the reunion claims of Louis XIV, who seized ancient imperial possessions in the Franche Comté, the Free County of Burgundy, Alsace, Lorraine, and Artois. Only a European coalition consisting of the Emperor, Spain, England, and the Netherlands had been sufficient to force France into a stalemate, something to bear in mind when we're searching for comparisons and precedents. The apparent weakness of the imperial system to prevent the loss of significant territory, the diplomatic and cultural preeminence of France, that and the ideas of the Enlightenment, in some cases exported to Germany through French thinkers, led to a cultural awakening in Germany, focusing on an embryonic conception of German nationalism, though still within the confines of the empire, i.e., that the empire would have to coalesce into a German nation-state rather than revolt against it. Perhaps this is best identified in the idea of Neuer Humanismus, or the new humanism, a term retroactively placed on thinkers such as Schiller, a historian of the 30 Years' War, and the author of Wallenstein, Herder, and Goethe in the 19th century after German unification. Goethe and Schiller embodied the era of Weimar classicism, Weimar from the network of artistic and intellectual patronage unique to that town, which lasted from 1772 until the end of the Holy Roman Empire. France declared war on Austria in April of 1792, ostensibly to secure revolution by expansion, and the king for the revolution by deposing of the hated diplomatic contrivance, the Austro-French alliance. The great German rulers of the era were dead, both Joseph II and Frederick the Great. Moreover, Joseph's brother, Leopold II, died shortly before the declaration of war. The French had hoped to exploit the death of Leopold II. The new ruler of Austria, Francis II, had yet to be crowned the elected Emperor of the Romans in Frankfurt, the logic being that a direct French assault on Austria, while there was technically no emperor, would serve to separate Austria from the other German states. Prussia and Austria had already expressed concern about the direction of the French Revolution after the flight of King Louis XVI to Varennes, and with the declaration of Pillnitz, they made a token gesture of support at the behest of the French émigrés around the Prince of Condé. Nevertheless, this declaration of war on Austria galvanized the support of Prussia into an imperial coalition against revolutionary France. The disorganized French army met with disaster in the Austrian Netherlands under Lafayette, and soon an imperial coalition army of Austria and Prussia was assembled under the Duke of Brunswick to invade France itself. With the declaration of the Brunswick Manifesto, the aim of the army was the restoration of the pre-revolutionary monarchy in France. Soon after, the army took the key fortress of Verdun. The manifesto electrified anti-royalist sentiment in Paris, and on the 10th of August 1792, Louis XVI was deposed by a revolutionary committee. Shortly before the proclamation of the French Republic, the imperial army was stopped at Valmy, and here, denied an easy victory, we see the limits of imperial cooperation. Prussia was concerned about a reform movement in Poland, withdrew its army, and collaborated with Russia to partition Poland yet again. While Prussia gained territory in this partition and spared its army, Austria and the German states alone weren't enough to prevent a French counterattack. Dumouriez took the Austrian Netherlands in the months following Valmy, while Custine struck at Germany itself, occupying the Palatinate and the pivotal city of Mainz, the electoral seat of the primate of all Germany, while the French established a revolutionary government there. The fall of Louis XVI was followed by his trial and execution. Thereafter, the imperial forces were augmented by Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, and Naples to form the First Coalition. Combined to this, the Imperial Diet was summoned to formally declare Reichskrieg, an imperial war in France, whereby Prussia and Austria would now have the formal backing of all the smaller states as an imperial army. The notion that the empire was moribund at this point is clearly moot, as it could still unite in common defense. Moreover, the implication of a declaration of an offensive war in France was that the smaller states would be compensated with possible territorial acquisitions at French expense, perhaps a restoration of the old imperial borders pre-Louis XIV, around the year 1648. Throughout 1793, the revolutionary government, now controlled by the Mountain faction or the Montagnard Jacobin faction, was threatened on all fronts and began losing territory, most notably in Mainz and Belgium, to the Empire after the Battle of Neerwinden, while facing internal rebellion from both Royalists and Republicans, Girondists, who often collaborated with the coalition, such as with the British at Toulon. As the tide of war turned decisively against France, Lazare Carnot issued the Levée en masse, the conscription of all French men under the age of 25, and the Austrians were later defeated at Wattignies. I have to clarify that I believe it's between the ages 17 and 25, not to indicate that children were being conscripted into the army. Having defeated the coalition forces invading France itself, General Jourdan mounted an offensive into Belgium and won the decisive victory at Fleurus. The victory at Fleurus effectively destroyed the coalition in the Low Countries and was the pivotal moment of the French campaign in Flanders, which up until that point had lasted 2 years. The Austrians abandoned Belgium definitively, while the Prussians no longer participated in the war, drawn again to the prospect of expanding its eastern borders in a final partition of Poland with Russia. Britain and the Netherlands were powerless against the French, and the Dutch Republic was seized, dissolved, and reconstituted as the new revolutionary Batavian Republic, a French client state. At the Peace of Basel, both Prussia and Hesse concluded a separate peace, in effect recognizing French conquests and their designs on the left bank of the Rhine, behind the back of both the Emperor and the Imperial Diet, and with it all the smaller German states. In spite of this betrayal, the Austrians and their remaining German allies, notably Bavaria and Saxony, frustrated a French attempt to reconquer Mainz, and the following year, a major French offensive into Germany, led by Jourdan and General Moreau, was defeated by the Archduke Charles of Austria at the battles of Amberg and Würzburg. By 1797, the Archduke Charles had defeated all French forces east of the Rhine, and yet German success was invalidated by Napoleon Bonaparte's unanticipated victories in Italy and subsequent invasion of Austria from the south. The Treaty of Campo Formio ended the War of the First Coalition and recognized the French conquest of the left bank of the Rhine and Belgium. The left bank was annexed to France, turned into 4 new departments, while Belgium was transformed into 9 departments, all part of the French Republic. While Austria had recognized this peace, many German princes, from the Bishop of Liège, the electors of Cologne and Trier, the Bavarians and the Palatinate, etc., had all lost in what amounted to the single greatest concession of imperial territory in the empire's 900-year history, to which the conquest of Louis XIV paled in comparison. France commenced deliberations at the Congress of Rastatt in Baden, with delegates representing the entire empire. The losing imperial princes had to be compensated. After all, the princes had been willing to declare war against France in anticipation of conquests, not losses. Any such compensation would entail a major restructuring of the empire's remaining territory, with the distant prospect of conflict or even civil war if the compensation wasn't considered equitable. Only France would benefit given such an outcome, as the princes vied with one another over the remaining territory. Perhaps thankfully for Austria, the French blundered into a second coalition after their attack on Rome and attempt to reconstitute Switzerland as another French client state, the Helvetic Republic. By the beginning of 1799, Austria and Russia under Suvorov were at war with France. The deliberations at Rastatt were suspended, and the Diet voted to resume the imperial war. Nevertheless, the resumption of hostilities wasn't received with enthusiasm by the smaller states, many of whom, including Prussia, remained neutral. In Italy, the war went extremely well for the coalition until the withdrawal of Suvorov's armies. Napoleon's coup and assumption of the power as the first consul and subsequent crossing of the Alps and victory at Marengo though was ultimately undid Suvorow's Italian campaign. Though the decisive blow to the empire was General Moreau's successful campaign into southern Germany, concluding at the Battle of Hohenlinden, where Moreau decisively defeated the combined army of Austria and Bavaria. After Austria's second defeat, the emperor and the empire collectively submitted to peace at the Treaty of Lunéville that restored the provisions of the Treaty of Campo Formio and formalized elements of what had been agreed at the Congress of Rastatt before the general peace settlement could be finalized. The solution for compensation took the form of mediatization, or a major restructuring of the Kleinstaaterei, the little states of the empire. This plan was as dramatic as it was controversial, as the rights of the smaller states had underpinned the peace in Germany following the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. Of the hundreds of recognized German principalities, 81 of them had been ecclesiastical principalities, held by a prince-bishop or even a prince-elector, the most prominent being the Elector of Mainz, the Arch-Chancellor of the Empire, and the Primate of all Germany. Effectively, if you can imagine, a politically empowered equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury, with his own state and with his own army. From the point of view of the secular princes, such territories were useless and could conceivably be incorporated into their own realms, as was even attempted by some Protestant princes before the 30 Years' War, though this policy of aggressive secularization ended with the Peace of Westphalia. With the coming of the Enlightenment and the secularizing reforms of even Catholic monarchs, the status of these ecclesiastical principalities became even more objectionable to the rulers that surrounded them. Both Frederick the Great and Joseph II had suggested broad secularizations as a potential compensation during both the wars of Austrian and Bavarian succession, yet none of them were implemented for fear of disturbing the delicate balance of power and, of course, feared of being considered tyrants and violators of the German liberty. After the Peace of Basel and the disaster of the Flanders campaign, Prussia intimated that secularizations would become a necessary part of a formal imperial settlement following the loss of so much territory. The Prussians touted this even for non-imperial princes, such as the Statthalter of the Netherlands, who had been dispossessed when the Netherlands had been abolished and reconstituted as the Batavian Republic. With no other options to provide adequate compensation on the scale of the losses, Rastatt agreed in principle to a series of secularizations. At Lunéville, this process was confirmed. It is perhaps not surprising that this process accelerated the demise of the empire. If the territorial losses and the humiliation for both the empire and its emperor were not enough, the Notrecht, or the law of necessity, which underpinned the rationale for secularization, would undermine centuries of precedent, the quasi-sovereignty of the German states, and thus the German liberty, and with it, the entire German constitutional settlement emanating from the Golden Bull of 1356. The loss of so much ecclesiastical territory would be seen, and was seen, as a major assault on the Catholic Church, and a much greater assault, it may be added, than when the French confiscated the Avignon enclave, or even church property, as Talleyrand's biens nationaux, or goods of the nation. It is no surprise that the new Pope Pius VII would at the beginning gravitate towards France after reaching a concordat with Napoleon in 1801, and would later officiate over the emperor's coronation, while the Holy Roman Emperor oversaw the elimination of ecclesiastical autonomy. That is not even to say that the emperor welcomed this proposal, rather it was an admission of total defeat. The ecclesiastical states invariably were loyal to the emperor. They constituted a useful voting bloc in the imperial diet, and often acted as a counterweight to powerful states, often on opposition to Austria, like Prussia. Sorry, stuttered a bit there. In their absence, Austria's enemies would only grow stronger: Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, etc., to such an extent that the aforementioned Saxony actually joined Austria out of fear of the enlargement of her rivals. Perhaps the final insult to Austria was that Napoleon and the new Tsar of Russia, Alexander, agreed to oversee this process as so-called mediating powers. Both parties could see the advantage of secularization at Austria's expense. For Napoleon, the consolidation of potential allies powerful enough to oppose Austria. Indeed, Paris had become a frantic hub of diplomatic activity, as delegations of princes petitioned France to recommend compensation, often with large bribes. For Alexander, the enlargement of the dynastic holdings of his German relatives was also in the offing. Prussia, who had abdicated its role in defense of the empire to pursue the acquisition of an empire in Poland, now relished the prospect of a new contiguous Prussian monolith stretching from Westphalia to Warsaw. What had once been a legally constituted empire would cease to be holy and simply exist as a random assortment collection of states. The restructuring of the empire was formalized in the so-called final recess of the Imperial Diet in 1803, the last major law passed before the empire's dissolution. The process of compensation had already been usurped from the Diet by the Russians and the French. Abbé de Talleyrand delivered the Diet an ultimatum as they convened in Regensburg, later ratified by this recess. And of course, the irony that Talleyrand, who had suggested the biens nationaux, the goods of the nation, the confiscation of church land in France, was also responsible for the implementation of an ultimatum and the secularization of church land in Germany. That, of course, that Talleyrand was also technically a cleric. Of the 51 imperial and free cities, another staple of imperial support, as they owed their emperor immediacy over all other princes and were thus technically his vassals, 45 of them were abolished and partitioned. States like Salzburg were turned into secular principalities, while the rest of the prince-bishoprics were annexed. The free cities and prince-bishoprics that survived did so because they performed some vital constitutional function in the empire, such as Frankfurt, where the coronation of the emperors was performed, Regensburg, where the Diet met, and Mainz, where the archbishop, as the most senior ecclesiastical official in Germany, resided. The old system of electors was abolished and electorates given to Salzburg, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse, though they would never participate in the election of an emperor. Bavaria was one of the principal beneficiaries of this new order. In 1799, Karl Theodor had died and been replaced by Maximilian Joseph. And with him, he invited one Count Montgelas to be his chief minister. After Hohenlinden, Montgelas reorientated Bavaria away from Austria to her traditional ally France, of course bearing in mind that Bavaria had been allied to France in both the War of Spanish Succession and the War of Austrian Succession. Indeed, the French and the Prussians had hoped that the Bavarians could effectively usurp the imperial title in the 1740s. And of course, not only did Bavaria begin to diplomatically gravitate towards France, but even imitated the footsteps of the revolution through the creation of a new civil code, which actually predated the Code Civil or Napoleonic Code in France. When hostilities between France and Britain resumed in 1803, after the failure of the Peace of Amiens, the electorate of Hanover was occupied by French forces. Meanwhile, Napoleon oversaw the execution without trial of one Louis Anton de Bourbon, an act that shocked the Swedish government to declare war on France with British material support. The execution of de Bourbon in particular sent fears throughout Europe that Napoleon was a Jacobin and prepared to inaugurate a new bloodletting of the European nobility. With the French poised to invade England in Boulogne, the British organized a third coalition against Napoleon. In 1804, Napoleon had crowned himself Emperor of the French with the Pope's blessing, and with many allusions and direct symbols to evoke Napoleon's connection to Charlemagne, the precursor of the Holy Roman Emperors. It should be noted that of all the new electors after the final recess, many owed their positions to the French, indeed Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, and would eventually join France to wage war against Austria. Faced with the elimination of his real authority in the empire and the ambitions of Napoleon to potentially usurp him in league with these new, essentially French-created electors, Francis II proactively made himself Emperor of Austria, giving the lands of the emperor, i.e. Bohemia, Galicia, Austria, Hungary, etc., though no longer Belgium since it's been lost to the empire, an overarching system of governance known as the Kaisertum. Until that point, Francis II had been the preeminent monarch of Christendom, a fact even recognized by Tsar Alexander. With the creation of this new imperial title, Francis could at least claim parity with Napoleon, if not superiority, while this new imperial crown was hereditary, not subject to the whims of the new electors. For 2 years, Francis II, elected Roman Emperor, ever Augustus, hereditary Emperor of Austria, would be the first and only Doppelkaiser, double Kaiser, though his fears and actions concerning the inevitable fate of the Holy Roman Empire were soon justified. Abandoning his invasion of Britain, Napoleon rushed to meet the Austrian army before it could join with the Russian forces under Kutuzov, now that Russia had entered the coalition alongside Austria. Napoleon captured half of the Austrian army under von Mack during the Ulm campaign in Württemberg before advancing on Vienna and capturing it for the first time. After Napoleon's reception in Vienna, he left the city to meet the remnants of the Austrian army and the main Russian army at Austerlitz. All the armies were personally commanded by their respective emperors. Austerlitz was Napoleon's greatest victory. Though Tsar Alexander and the Russians escaped, Francis himself met Napoleon after the battle to conclude peace. At Pressburg, Austria was forced out of the war and forced to give even more territory to France's German allies, Bavaria and Württemberg, though Napoleon did not abolish the empire. Over the following months, following Austerlitz, Napoleon contrived various means of subordinating his German allies to France in perpetuity. Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg became members of the Confederation of the Rhine, or my much more preferred title if you render it in German, the Rheinbund, and this was created in July of 1806. When the Regensburg Imperial Diet protested at the creation of this new confederation, the members of the confederation refused to even acknowledge the existence of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon, shortly after, issued Francis II an ultimatum to abdicate the throne. Francis and his court had anticipated such and perceived that upon his abdication, the remaining princes of the empire would contrive the election of Napoleon, simply using the Confederation of the Rhine to nullify the current emperor's real authority. If Francis refused, Napoleon could use this as a pretext to invade Austria again and compel the emperor's abdication by force. Faced with a renewal of hostilities and the opposition of Napoleon's German clients, the emperor accepted that his abdication was inevitable. He would not, however, gift the imperial throne to Napoleon, increasing the prestige of his enemy and subjugating his own lands to Napoleon in the process. Rather, Francis II in August of 1806, August the 6th to be precise, announced both his abdication and with it the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, on that basis that the situation in Germany had made the status of the empire and his own fidelity to his electoral capitulation, effectively the German equivalent of a coronation oath, impossible. The emperor's dissolution of the empire was not universally accepted. On one account, Germany found itself without a unifying body for the first time since the creation of East Francia in the 9th century. And so, in a legalistic sense, Francis had not only dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, but he had also dissolved the German nation. Empire or no, Napoleon continued full speed with his plan for further mediatization of German land. On the ruin of the Holy Roman Empire, the remaining states of Germany, besides Austria, Prussia and Hanover, not to mention the small Danish holdings in Holstein and the Swedish possessions in Pomerania, were incorporated into the new Confederation of the Rhine. The new King of Bavaria wanted sovereignty, and so at the head of the Confederation was not an emperor, but the former elector of Mainz, Karl Theodor von Dalbach, who was now Prince Primate of this new confederation, to oversee what was in effect already the defunct Diet of the Confederation, defunct in the sense that throughout the Confederation's 7-year history, it was never assembled. At its height in 1808, the Confederation boasted 36 members, down from the 300 or so original members of the Holy Roman Empire. Though Napoleon had gifted his allies with higher ranks and even conferred the rank of king on Württemberg and Bavaria, and of course even Bavaria was given Tyrol, a former Austrian possession, the notion of real sovereignty, which was expected and demanded from France's allies, was a complete farce. The members of the Confederation were not allies, they were clients. Von Dalberg was a figurehead, and Napoleon, as protector of the Confederation, dictated its foreign policy and conscripted levies for the Grand Armée, while Napoleon executed German nationalist and pamphleteer Johann Philipp Palm for protesting and opposing Napoleon's consolidation of authority in Germany. Prussia had remained at peace with France in 1795, exploiting France's victories and the process of mediatization to grow in size, while Prussia had been one of the main beneficiaries of the partitions of Poland. After Austerlitz, neutral Prussia found itself alone in Germany, as Napoleon cajoled the lesser states into the Confederation of the Rhine. Only Saxony was able to resist Napoleon. 1806 was perhaps the last year Napoleon could have hoped for a general peace settlement with Britain, as Pitt had died and a pro-peace Whig party, the so-called Cabinet of All Talents, had taken power. The sticking issue was over Hanover, a possession of King George III, who was also the Elector of Hanover. Sweden was still at war with France, and Sweden even positioned itself as the defender of the German nation during some very contentious allusion to the legacy of Gustavus Adolphus and his intervention during the 30 Years' War. Indeed, the Swedish were more interested in remaining in Germany to prevent the fall of Swedish Pomerania and believed that the French reconquest of Hanover would facilitate this. To ensure Prussia didn't enter the war against France, Napoleon had promised Hanover to Prussia. Nevertheless, not only did France forcefully eject Prussian troops from formerly Prussian areas in the west, such as Cleves, to give the territory to Napoleon's brother-in-law Murat, but Prussia discovered secret negotiations between Britain and France to return Hanover to Britain. Napoleon's overtures to Prussia to compensate her further for the Confederation of the Rhine, possibly with the creation of a Prussian-led German North Confederation, something which would be created after the Wars of Bismarck in the 1860s, were not considered genuine. Rather, Napoleon was considered duplicitous, untrustworthy, and in October of 1806, Prussia, together with Saxony, declared war on France, expecting Russian support. Russia, however, was slow to mobilize, leaving Prussia and Saxony effectively isolated in Germany and vulnerable to French attack. Within 2 weeks, Marshal Davout had defeated the main Prussian army at Auerstedt, while Napoleon defeated Hohenlohe at Jena. In the case of Davout, he had defeated a Prussian army, despite being outnumbered 3-1. The remainder of the Prussian army was captured at Erfurt. And again, it should be noted that Napoleon, in his constant myth-making, such as ostracizing Moreau after the victory at Hohenlinden and emphasizing Marengo as more integral to the Second Coalition than Hohenlinden, Napoleon took credit for Davout's great victory at Auerstedt by, rather than having the battles as separate conflicts, separate altercations, which they were, Jena and Auerstedt. Instead, we have the contrivance of the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, in which, of course, Napoleon was victorious, rather than Davout and Napoleon. Rather than punishing the Prussians' allies, the Saxons, Napoleon was able to play on the previous enmity between the two German states. Thereafter, Saxony had become one of Napoleon's staunchest allies. Indeed, if you remember the history of the campaigns of Frederick the Great, Saxony had been targeted and occupied during the 7 Years' War, and it had always been on the mind of various Prussian kings that the security of Berlin and indeed its connection with Silesia couldn't be secured until Prussia had annexed Saxony. And so in this case, Napoleon was able to, in a rare move in terms of his diplomatic ability, sever the alliance and was able to bring Saxony over as a willing French ally. Within 1 month, Napoleon entered Berlin, and from Berlin, and with no prospect of peace with Britain in sight, created the continental system of economic warfare. Rather than make peace, the Prussian army and court retreated to Königsberg near the Russian border. Napoleon invaded Prussian Poland while a major anti-Prussian insurrection was taking place. Having already incorporated Polish emigres into his army, Napoleon exploited this wave of Polish nationalism to both entice his Saxon allies and create a new ally in establishing the Duchy of Warsaw with a Saxon king as its nominal duke, a historical allusion to the fact that when the von Wettins in the early 18th century were both electors of Saxony and kings of Poland and Lithuania. This duchy was carved out of the remnants of the second and third Prussian partitions of Poland and would soon be augmented by the Austrian partitions as well in 1809. Napoleon forced the Swedes into an armistice and they would eventually lose Pomerania, while Napoleon confronted the Russians at Eylau, a stalemate, before defeating the Russians decisively at the Battle of Friedland. At Tilsit, Napoleon conducted a generous peace treaty with Russia, meeting the Tsar personally, who joined the continental system and declared war on Great Britain. Prussia, meanwhile, was not so lucky. At Tilsit, Prussia consented to the loss of over half of her territory and population, most of which was awarded to Saxony and the new Saxon-led Duchy of Warsaw. Moreover, Prussia was compelled into the position of unwilling ally to Napoleon. though Prussia was spared incorporation into the Confederation of the Rhine as a formal French client state. With the conclusion of the Fourth War, the Fourth Coalition War, Germany had effectively been conquered by Napoleon. Out of the Prussian former territories in the west, Napoleon carved out a new kingdom for his brother Jerome Bonaparte, the Kingdom of Westphalia. Westphalia and the Grand Duchy of Berg, which was briefly ruled directly by Napoleon himself, were the most Frenchified of the German states, and followed France in the implementation of the Civil Code, the Napoleonic Code. Unlike Prussia, states like Bavaria were willing clients of France, and through Montgelas styled their administration off of France and were rewarded for it, with the Bavarian possession of Tyrol and the acquisition of much land, pushing the boundaries of Bavaria further west, further east, and further north than they ever had been. Bavaria perhaps uniquely benefited from being an ally of Napoleon, and then secured her gains by picking the correct moment to switch sides when Napoleon's fall seemed imminent in 1813. Saxony, on the other hand, went along with France, but resisted attempts to Frenchify Saxon law and administration, and was perhaps the unluckiest of France's German allies when the king and duke chose to remain loyal to Napoleon as his armies were conducting most of the battles on his territory, there being Dresden and Leipzig. Though the mediatizations had streamlined the borders of Germany's principalities, and they would be again streamlined in 1806 and again in 1808, Germany was still home to many smaller states, clustered principally in Franconia, Thuringia, and of course we mentioned the three Anhalts, the five Saxes, Saxe-Weimar, Saxe-Coburg, etc., and the four principalities of Reuss, and of course the region of Hesse. There is Hesse, the former Landgravate of Hesse, or the Grand Duchy of Hesse, combined with many other Hesses surrounding it. For his loyalty to Napoleon as Prince Primate, von Dalberg was created the hereditary Grand Duke of Frankfurt, Frankfurt also being the capital of this new confederation, though Napoleon had his own imperial capital in Germany at Erfurt in Thuringia, a direct part of the French Empire. In 1808, Napoleon had made the disastrous decision to invade Spain. In so doing, Napoleon, beyond the damage to his prestige, needed to maintain a large garrison to secure the regime of his brother Joseph against an increasingly hostile population, waging guerrilla war on the French garrisons. Of course, guerrilla comes from this time. Recognizing the blunder, Napoleon convened a lavish congress at his German capital in Erfurt in an attempt to woo the Tsar of Russia to confirm his agreements at Tilsit. But Napoleon needed more. He needed Russian participation to check any possible Austrian reprisal now that Napoleon was weakened. Napoleon was even prepared to recognize the Russian conquest of Finland. As the reduction of Austria and a powerful France wasn't in Russian interest, the Congress achieved only Alexander's nominal approval and increased the likelihood of a renewal of hostilities in Germany. Meanwhile, in Spain, an Anglo-Portuguese force under Arthur Wellesley, the later Duke of Wellington, defeated a second invasion of Portugal, and afterwards Wellesley invaded Spain. During this time, Austria secured a secret arrangement with the Tsar of Russia that should Austria attack France, Russia would only make token moves to aid her, while Talleyrand has switched sides to begin advising the Tsar and would later be dismissed as France's foreign secretary. When Austria reached out to Prussia to join them, Napoleon intercepted the correspondence and imposed on Prussia the Convention of Paris, reducing its army to 40,000 men and demanding heavy reparations. As the French were garrisoned throughout Prussia, the Prussians were powerless to resist. Without hard guarantees of support, the Austrians hoped that the Prussians would join in a patriotic German uprising to drive out the French. With the British prepared to finance the war, and Napoleon sending more troops to Spain, Francis decided that this was an opportune moment to attack France and seize the initiative. The Austrians had raised an army of some 300,000 men, larger than any of the previous engagements with Napoleon. The size of the army was made possible by the Austrian introduction of conscription, in imitation of Les Arcanots' levy en masse, though unlike the French, the Austrian army was fundamentally multinational. Combined to this was the large militia contingent, the Landwehr. In April of 1809, Archduke Charles of Austria-Teschen invaded Bavaria. Nevertheless, Napoleon was able to mobilize quicker than expected and engage the Austrians in person, defeating them at the Battle of Abensberg, while Davout defeated the Austrians at Teugn-Husen. At Ratisbon, Napoleon was victorious but wounded. As the Grand Armée advanced into Austria itself, Napoleon met the main Austrian army under the Archduke Charles at Aspern-Essling, where Napoleon was personally defeated and lost over 20,000 men, including one of his best marshals, Jean Lannes. Despite this unanticipated Austrian victory over Napoleon, the Archduke failed to exploit it, and Napoleon's army survived and regrouped. After 6 weeks of recovery and organization, Napoleon and the Austrians met in one of the largest battles in human history at Wagram, with 300,000 participants on both sides, with the French slightly outnumbering the Austrians. The French claimed victory, though casualties on both sides were vast, both armies losing around 30,000 men. A few days later, Napoleon reached up with the Archduke's army at Znaim and agreed to a ceasefire, though Napoleon's victory was tentative and exposed the vulnerability of his position after his invasion of Spain. Elsewhere in Germany, there were anti-French uprisings, though not as significant as the Austrians had hoped, to turn the tide of the war. In the Tyrol, Andreas Hofer assembled a militia of 80,000 irregulars, which led an insurgency until the winter of 1809. The Bavarian administration in the formerly Austrian province was overwhelmed and required the assistance of France and even the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy under Eugene de Beauharnais to crush the rebellion. Unimpressed with the Bavarian performance, Napoleon gifted the south of Tyrol to Italy, what would later become the Trentino and is still today part of Italy. In opposition to the Bonapartist Kingdom of Westphalia, the former Duke of Brunswick, who had now been dispossessed, led a volunteer force, the so-called Black Brunswickers, to assist the Austrians in their attack on Saxony. Their forces combined forced Dresden to fall, and with it the rest of Saxony. Upon discovering that the Austrians had signed a separate armistice, the Duke led his volunteers out of Germany to offer his services and that of the Black Brunswickers to Britain. And I believe they served in the campaign at Waterloo under the Duke of Wellington. With Austria defeated by Napoleon for a fourth time, Metternich rose in the ranks of the imperial court as foreign minister and suggested a definitive rapprochement with Napoleon. By the terms of the treaty, Austria ceded Salzburg to Bavaria, Dalmatia and Trieste to France as the provinces of Illyria. A part of Austrian Galicia in Poland was given up to the new Duchy of Warsaw. Despite Russian neutrality, Napoleon awarded the Tsar a sliver of territory east of Lemberg in Tarnopol. At Metternich's suggestion, Austria became not only an ally, but a willing ally of France, and joined the continental system. After so many defeats, Metternich did not anticipate that Napoleon could possibly fall, and instead decided to ingratiate Austria into this new Napoleonic order. He seized upon this opportunity to exploit Napoleon's lack of an heir. Of course, he'd been married to Josephine, who was 6 years older than him, and Josephine, of course, was barren, possibly after her incarceration when her husband was killed. Though militarily defeated, Austria could provide Napoleon with both an heir and the legitimacy associated with marrying into Europe's most illustrious house. And of course, this is the image of Napoleon supposedly marrying Mary Louisa. But as with so much of Napoleonic propaganda, such as the famous image of Madame Mère, Napoleon's mother, in the coronation portrait by David, this is entirely a fantasy. They weren't married in person, rather they were married in proxy, and they met later. Indeed, Metternich followed and observed Napoleon's new wife, Mary Louise, while he attempted to win concessions from Napoleon in person. Though Austrian territory was lost for good, Metternich convinced Napoleon to remove treaty limitations on the size of Austria's army. Once back in Austria, Metternich recommended censoring any anti-French sentiment in the press while resisting Russian pressure to join in a future coalition. Instead, Metternich signed a formal alliance with Napoleon that earmarked 30,000 men for the eventual invasion of Russia. While Metternich ensured that Austria received favorable treatment compared to other French clients, that is ultimately what Austria was, the greatest of France's clients. Only the ebbing of Napoleon after the disastrous campaign in Russia of 1812 would rescue Austria from a descent into virtual irrelevance. With the pacification of Austria and Metternich's détente, only Prussia remained inwardly hostile to France, yet alone was impotent to resist. The rest of Napoleon fared little better. In 1810, the same year as Napoleon's marriage to Mary Louise, former French allies such as an enlarged Oldenburg were annexed to France, along with the remnants of Hanover, which Napoleon partitioned with his brother Jerome in Westphalia. Napoleon had conquered Germany. The status of its territories, whether as clients, allies, or direct possessions of the empire, and the system of departments, was subject to his increasingly arbitrary whim. He had destroyed one empire of the German nation and compelled the remnants of a divided Germany into his new Carolingian facsimile, though German nationalism was at a point to in effect an equally strong reaction to the French conquest when the possibility of Napoleon's fall presented itself with the failure of the Russian campaign of 1812. And that is where I'm going to leave it for this lecture, and of course indicating that I'll come back and discuss Russia and a lecture called Undoing the French Revolution, which will cover 1812 through to 1822. So thank you everyone for listening. There is a bonus lecture tomorrow night, which is for members only, discussing the Peninsular War when the French invaded Spain and were involved in a grueling 5-year guerrilla campaign. So please, if you are a member, go and watch that stream tomorrow night. Otherwise, there is a discussion on Monday which I've titled The Grand Strategy of the Napoleonic Empire. It's still part of this series of exporting the French Revolution, but I really want to have a discussion to try and tease out a consistent pattern or an overarching strategy, and ultimately what Napoleon's end goal was in terms of the creation of a new Carolingian empire. I've already tried to intimate that there are various elements where you can draw connections between Napoleon's heart or the center of his empire being in the creation of a new Middle Francia, northern Italy, eastern France, Western Germany, etc., the Low Countries, and to what extent Napoleon's conquest would have panned out given more successes. And of course, was there any ultimate logic in terms of the effectiveness of his own battle strategy, etc. So I'm going to be discussing the battles and overall grand strategy of the Napoleonic Empire on Monday at 9 o'clock. Other than that, thank you everyone for listening. Do remember to leave a comment, like, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you everyone for listening, and good night.